Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you've joined me. Now, before we get started, I am going to do a small commercial for my newest book, God Has Not Changed His Mind, His Pursuit of Image and Likeness, which is now on pre-sale for the low price of $14.99. And you can find the book at www.fardistancespublications.com. And if you go out to the website, you will also see this book on sale, Fire Upon the Earth, which is another book about his pursuit of image and likeness. Now, this book looks like it's selling for free, that I forgot to put a price on the website. I didn't. It's free. All you have to do is pay for shipping. So if you would like this book, order it and I will have it sent out to you as soon as possible. Last week, we talked about Saul's inability to rise above the events that happened long before he was born. And because those events happened, because of the sin of Gibeah, Saul saw himself little in his own eyes. It didn't matter what the Lord had done. It didn't matter that he was anointed king. It didn't matter that his wisdom and valor was on display before the nations. None of it mattered. He was an insecure, fearful mess who in the end was disqualified from the place God had put him. God had to raise up another to rule and reign over Israel. And of course, that was David. Now you'll find a link to that podcast if you haven't listened to it in the description below. Today, we are going to talk about Nehemiah and the spiritual declension of the remnant. First, a little history. I hope you're a little like me and like history. I really do. History is my favorite subject in school, and most of the books I read are history books. But it's important to know the history of the Bible, to know the political, the geopolitical, the world events that were happening during the time the Bible was written. And the reason we need to know that is because it helps the Bible become more alive if you can see it against the context and the backdrop upon which it was happening. So I hope you brought your Bible because we will be using it a lot during this podcast. So the first place we want to go is Leviticus 18:24 through 28, when the Lord tells the tribes the penalty if they choose to worship false gods in the land that he had given them. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nations that was before you. They knew, even before they took the land, what would happen if they chose to worship idols. Unfortunately, Israel did not listen. Now, if you know your history, you know that the tribes split into two after the reign of Solomon. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam and made their own land, and 2 tribes stayed with the king, or Rehoboam, and established what was known as Judah. Israel was the first to be judged for the sin of idolatry. In 740 BC, the Assyrians attacked and captured Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. Now, the Assyrians had a policy. Once they captured a land, they stripped the land of all its inhabitants and sent them somewhere else to live. Then they stripped the land of all its assets. There was nothing left in the land that the people could use to build their lives upon. Then they transplanted other captured people into a conquered territory. So the people of Israel went out, the Assyrians stripped the land, and new people came in. And these new transplants were people from Babylon, Kutha, Ea, Hamat, and Sepharvaim. Now they occupied what was known as Israel. These are the people that are going to become the Samaritans. Once these people get into the land, they begin to worship their false gods. Now, God isn't going to judge Israel for idol worship and then allow these new people to remain in the land that he put his name on and worship idols. So what happened is he loosed lions among them, and the people cried out to the king of Assyria and said, there's a God in this land that we don't know anything about, and he's killing us. So can you send us teachers and priests so that they can instruct us in this God? The Assyrians, generosity on display, sent one priest who returned to Bethel, told the people about the law of Moses, who God was, the temple, all of it. And all these people did was add this God to the pantheon of gods they were already serving and worshiping. And like I said, these people became the Samaritans that we meet in the New Testament. You would have thought that the people in Judah, watching Israel be destroyed and the people taken into captivity, they would have learned a lesson. That they would have said, oh my word, we've got to get these idols out of here. But they did not. They continued to worship false gods, ignoring all the prophets God sent to them. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar attacks Judah to secure his trade routes through the land on the way to Egypt. It wouldn't be until 19 years later that he captures Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes the people captive to Babylon. That's where they are 70 years later. Belteshazzar, I know, that's a name. Belteshazzar, he is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. He rules over a fading and decaying Babylonian empire. And Cyrus and the Persians are laying siege to Babylon. Now, Babylon is a magnificent archaeological wonder. It has thick walls, bronze gates, and the Euphrates has been diverted to create a moat around the city. So Cyrus and his Persian army are on the outside trying to figure out how to take the city. The city, though, does not feel comfortable. They don't feel safe behind their thick walls. So in order to distract his nobles, Belteshazzar has a grand feast. And it was during this feast that he calls for the temple vessels to be brought in so that they could eat and drink out of them. Wrong move. A disembodied hand writes upon the wall these words. I hope I do them justice. Many, tekel upharsin. We're going to the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verses 25 through 28. Of course, when that happens, Belteshazzar is a little freaked out, and I can't blame him. So he calls for Daniel to come in and tell him what the words mean. And this is what Daniel tells him. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed in the balance, and you have been found wanting. In the English Standard Version, it says Perez. In the King James, I believe it says upharsin. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So the Babylonian kingdom was coming to an end. And in fact, it would end that night because Cyrus had figured out the key to attacking Babylon. He diverted the Euphrates so that the riverbed, the moat around the Euphrates, around the city, dried up. And when it dried up, it left a gap between the riverbank and the bronze gates. And he ducked under, his army ducked under. That night, Belteshazzar was killed, and the Persians were in charge of the Babylonian Empire. So, according to the historian Josephus, Daniel takes a scroll of Isaiah to Cyrus, opens it up, and shows him, this is Isaiah 45, shows him where the Lord had prophesied how Cyrus would take the city. And Cyrus is thoroughly blown away and impressed, so he decides to allow the captives in Babylon to return to Judah, rebuild the city and the temple if they so choose. And not only that, but he gave them the vessels and the furniture that Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple when he captured it and burned it. and allowed them to return with them to Judah. 50,000 Jews decided to return. That's not all Cyrus did. He sent a royal edict out to all the governors in the provinces beyond the river. Now, beyond the river, of course, is the Euphrates River. And he told those governors that they were to help the Jewish people reestablish the city and the temple. They were to give money if the remnant needed it. And they were also to provide the remnant animals on Cyrus's behalf so that they could offer up sacrifices to their God on his behalf. Now, when the remnant arrives in Jerusalem, the walls are torn down. The temple is just burnt ruins. The first thing they do is they build an altar. They built the altar because they were afraid of the surrounding nations, and they saw themselves as too small, too little, and too helpless to protect themselves if these nations took umbrage at what Cyrus had called them to do. Now, the nations aren't going to do that. They're not going to risk their lives and disobey Cyrus's decree, because that's what's going to happen. The governors would either have been, they probably would have been replaced, and they probably would have been killed, because Cyrus's word is law. And it's so sad that these people had the word of the Lord, a royal decree that none of the governors would go against, and yet they were so afraid that they manifested their fear in the building of the altar. Now, the Samaritans had been in the land for about 187 years, and a subtle deception had begun to creep into their worldview. They were still semi-pagan, but they believed their worship of the Lord made them equal to the Jews in the Lord's eyes. How bad was that deception? Remember in John 4:12? This is what the Samaritan woman told Jesus about the well that he was seated in. You'll find it starting in verse 12, John 4. Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. Jacob's not their father. They're transplanted people in from the Assyrians. They have no connection to the land. That's the way the Assyrians wanted it. They wanted them to have no connections to the land whatsoever. So these new people wouldn't have any reason to restore former history and former glory. The land had been stripped bare, and their only pursuit would be just to scratch out a living in a land that was working against them. But by the time the remnant came back, the Samaritans had thought that they were equal to God or equal to the Jews because they worshiped the same God. And by the time Jesus came, hundreds and hundreds of years later, they think they have come from Jacob, that they're Jacob's son too. That is a subtle deception. So the Samaritans send an envoy to the elders in Jerusalem and say, hey, we worship this God too. We'd like to help you build the temple because we want to come in and worship. And the Jews said no. Well, the Samaritans did not like that answer at all. So they decided if they weren't going to help build the temple, there'd be no temple at all. Now, the Jews had created an office of counselor, that these counselors are going to help them decide the best way to build the temple. And the Samaritans bribed these counselors to slow down the work so that the temple couldn't be built until they heard from Darius. Who is Darius? Darius is Cyrus's nephew. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he didn't stay in Babylon. He returned to Persia, which is the stronghold of his power, and he left his nephew Darius on the throne in Babylon. It was to Darius the people in the surrounding nations, led by the Samaritans, sent word to Darius and told him that he would be foolish to allow the Jews to build the temple and to restore Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was a regional power. And if Jerusalem became a regional power again, that they would overthrow the Babylonians. And Darius read the letters, sent back word to the remnant to stop building, which is so. They had the word of the Lord. They had Cyrus's decree. When Darius sent word saying stop building, all they had to do was send an envoy to Darius and say, no, Cyrus gave us permission. And Darius would have allowed the building to go on. But they didn't. All they did was stop building and look to to restoring their homeland, to create for themselves homes and businesses so that they could survive in this land and hopefully get a little bit of power against these nations that were constantly threatening them. Here's a spiritual lesson. The remnant was perfectly willing to settle for what the enemy would allow them to have instead of pursuing the Lord's will for them. How many times has that happened in my life or in your life? That the Lord has told you something to do, and outside pressure from the enemy slowly and surely erodes the promise until you just let it go. All you're doing is settling in to what the small territory the enemy will allow you to have. God didn't send them back to Jerusalem so that the enemies could stifle his will. He gave them everything they needed. They had the word of the Lord and Cyrus's decree, and to them it meant nothing. But the nations also learned a valuable lesson, and this is so important. They understood that the remnant wouldn't exercise the political power that they had, but they would always take the path of least resistance in order to save their lives. They were quite content to live in this small territory as long as they didn't exercise or excite the passions or the hatred of the nation. And again, there's a spiritual side to this. I always say don't take life personally. And I know that's very hard to do because life is personally happening to you. This is something I stumble over and over again because a slight happens, an offense happens, someone says something I don't like, someone hurts my feelings. And what do? I take it personally. And now I have a fight on my hands because I am now consumed with what they did instead of what the Lord told me to do. That's why you can't take life personally, because the enemy's radar goes off and says, as long as I keep doing that to her, she will keep reacting in a total fleshy and carnal way. And what the Lord's work in her will be stifled because she can't concentrate on two things at one time. I can't worship the Lord and hold slight and offense in my heart, because the slight and the offense takes precedence. They've hurt my feelings. How dare they? Do they? Oh, how dare they? And now I have wounded feelings, can open, worms everywhere, and it just stifles the Lord's work. That's what I mean when I say you can't take life personally. Again, it's a lesson I'm still learning. I don't take life as personally as I do, but there are times when I am triggered by an event, and all I do is reveal to the enemy, if you keep hitting that trigger, she'll keep responding in a total fleshy and carnal way, and he'll have me in his clutches. That's what the nations learned when Israel stopped building. When Judah, I should say the remnant, because they're in Judah, and that's how they'll be known as Judeans. When Judah stopped building, instead of sending an envoy to Darius and say, no, Cyrus said we could do this. Now a famine breaks out in the land, and the people don't understand why. And it's just a tremendous, damaging, life-threatening famine. And finally, God raises up Haggai. So we're going to go to the book of Haggai, and this is why the Lord tells them that the land is in a famine. I'm in Haggai chapter 1, verse 1. And in the second year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai, the prophet, to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, I know these names. Governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourself, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them in a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I might take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, and behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why, declares the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. Therefore the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And I have called for a drought on the land, and the hills on the grain, and the new wine, the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and on all their labors. So the land was under judgment because they would not do what God called them to do. They had his word, they knew, but they decided it wasn't worth the risk of the nation's anger, and so they busied themselves trying to rebuild or reestablish themselves in the land. But once they heard the word of the Lord from Haggai, and Zerubbabel and Joshua added their word to it and encouraged them to do it, they set out and they started to rebuild the temple. So the nations sent envoys to Jerusalem to ask them by what authority they are rebuilding. And this time the Jews said, Cyrus. So the nations sent a letter to Darius explaining to him what is happening. The Jews' response that they are building because Cyrus gave them permission. They ask him to search the royal archives to see if maybe a decree like that exists. So Darius orders the royal archives searched, and lo and behold, there's Cyrus's decree. So Darius is going to allow a third wave of refugees, or a third wave of the remnant, to return to Judah. This time they are led by Ezra, the scribe and the priest. But listen to what Darius does. He tells Ezra that the law of Moses is to be taught not only in Judah, but in the surrounding nations. The law of Moses is now going to be the foundation of justice within the province beyond the river. The governors were to obey, or they would suffer banishment, confiscation of goods, imprisonment, or death. What this decree did would make Jerusalem the center of justice, culture, and worship. The law of Moses would become the foundation for the daily living in the province. This is amazing. Look what God had done for them. He was taking his truth, he was taking his light, and he was spreading it now throughout the nations. All the remnant had to do was obey, but they didn't. They decided they were too weak to impose their will upon the nation. It wasn't their will. Obviously, it's the Lord's will, but it's also Darius's will, and that's what matters to these governors. They would have listened to what Darius said. They would have welcomed the Jewish teachers and the Jewish magistrates and the Jewish judges into their land, because if they didn't, Darius already told them, I'll kill you and replace you with people who will allow it. And that remarkable decree giving them favored nation status slipped right through their fingers. They had a temple, but very little else. Now, during this time, something terrible is going to happen within the land. Jerusalem's elites are going to enter into business alliances with the enemy. And to cement these alliances, they're going to give their sons and daughters in marriage. So these families are now going to be intertwined through familial alliances. And look what happens to the people, to the poor. The foreigners now take over large segments of Judah's economy. And that makes it impossible for the poor to pay the Persian tribute and the governor's exorbitant taxes, because he's trying to live a lavish lifestyle that would rival the Samaritan's governor or Ammon's governor or Moab's governor. And it takes a lot of money to do that. So what do the poor do? They borrow money from the elites at interest rates they can never repay. And they knew when they took the loans out that they couldn't repay it, but they had to pay their taxes. And when the loans came due, the elites did the following. They demanded payment, of course, and then they foreclosed on their lands first, their vineyards, their flocks, their herds, and then their houses. And when there was nothing left for them to foreclose on, the people had no choice but to sell what was left. They sold their daughters, and then they sold their sons into slavery. Judah's wealth went into their enemies' money bags with the blessing of Judah's elites who got their cut. It was a thoroughly corrupt political system, and the poor were paying the price. And the nations were constantly reinforcing the people's thoughts about themselves. The people's worldview was on display. The nations saw it, and they exerted pressure against those worldviews, and the people retreated and kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller in the land that God had given them. Why were the nations doing that? Because the nations lived in fear that if the people ever stepped into their identity as God's covenant people, the region's balance of power would be turned on its head. Listen, same thing spiritually. Why does the enemy press you and press you and press you through life, through trials and tribulations, through things that people say, things that people do? Why does he keep pressing you into a smaller and smaller piece of territory? Because he knows the moment you step into your identity as God's covenant people, the region of balance in your territory would be turned on its head. If he can get you to constantly think about what is going on in life, what is happening in life, how life is pressuring, and I'm not discounting the pressure. I'm not being insensitive and saying that you don't have pressure. Please don't hear that. I'm just saying I know what it's like to constantly be forced to retreat and retreat and to retreat and to retreat until there's nothing left. And that's the enemy's strategy, because he doesn't want you to ever realize who you are in God, because the moment you do, you will step forth in the word and the promises that God have given you, and the power of balance in your sphere of influence will be turned on its head. In 445 BC, Nehemiah's brother Hanani comes to Susa, the capital of Persia. And Nehemiah there is the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes. And this is what he tells Nehemiah, who has asked him, how are the remnant faring in Jerusalem or in the land? And I am in Nehemiah 1, 3 through 4. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed. Nehemiah is devastated by this news. And what he does is he goes and he intercedes day and night before the Lord, crying out that he be the one who goes and reestablishes the wall and sets the gates, because the people are in great distress. He realizes their problems are not political, but spiritual. And no matter the edicts and the decrees that come from Persia or Babylon, those decrees and those edicts aren't enough to cause the people to get out of trouble. The true problem, and he realizes this, the true problem is the glory of the Lord has been lost. And the glory will always be lost when you are preoccupied with yourself instead of God. And the remnant was definitely preoccupied with themselves. He wants to go to Jerusalem. He wants to go to Jerusalem and reestablish the glory of the Lord and to reestablish the Lord's great name in the region. But he just can't up and go because he's Artaxerxes' cupbearer. He's a slave in Persia, and he's going to need Artaxerxes' permission. So he prays for the Lord to give him favor with Artaxerxes. And about 5 or 6 months later, he's pouring wine, and he's more than the wine pourer. A cupbearer is more than a wine pourer. He does more than test food. He's actually an advisor. He's actually one of the advisors the king would go to if the king had a problem, because Nehemiah possessed great wisdom, and Artaxerxes recognized it. So 5 or 6 months later, he was pouring the king his wine when the king noticed that Nehemiah was awfully sad. And why was Nehemiah sad? Because he wasn't sick. So sadness that didn't compute with Artaxerxes. So he said, "Hey, what's going on with you? What's the matter with you?" And Nehemiah said, "My sadness is because my people in Jerusalem are beaten down, and there's no one there to reestablish the walls, set the gate, and remind them who they are." Now Artaxerxes said, "Okay, I'll let you go back. It's only temporary. You can only stay for a certain time. Then you're going to have to return to Susa." Nehemiah agrees, and he's soon on his way to Jerusalem. He's got a royal escort and more edicts in his hand from Artaxerxes. Now we're going to meet 3 men who are going to become Nehemiah's nemesis. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria; Tobiah, an official of Ammon, and Sanballat's right-hand man when it comes to persecuting the Jews; and Geshem the Arab. Now, Geshem the Arab, I think, is like a little sidekick. He doesn't really do much, but the main contributors to Nehemiah's problems are actually going to be Sanballat and Tobiah. Now, Nehemiah gives these men Artaxerxes' decree, and these men know now that they are stifled by what Artaxerxes said. So they are going to need to stop Nehemiah in a way that they don't disobey the decrees that Artaxerxes had sent. Now, Sanballat and Tobiah had married into Jerusalem's nobility. So the first thing they do when they find out that Nehemiah is going to rebuild the walls, which they don't want to have happen, they begin to apply pressure to those familiar alliances. Those nobles begin to feel Sanballat and Tobiah's pressure because they want the nobles to revolt against Nehemiah. They want the nobles to say to Nehemiah, no, we're not doing that. We don't care what Artaxerxes said. Here's where Sanballat and Tobiah are going wrong. They don't realize it yet. They will in a moment, but they don't realize it. They believe Nehemiah is just another Jew who shares the remnant's worldview, and if they press on him, he will fold like the remnant had been doing year after year after year. What they don't understand is that Nehemiah's worldview did not come from the remnant. It came from those days and nights he spent in the Lord's presence, crying out for the remnant, crying out for Jerusalem, crying out for the glory to be restored, and crying out for God's great name to be restored. He isn't going to be stopped. He doesn't share the remnant's worldview and build walls and set gates. He came to vindicate the holiness of the Lord's great name, which had been profaned and diminished throughout the territories. Listen, the remnant had the audacity to claim that they were God's chosen people, yet they refused to live as if they were. And that right there convicts the daylights out of me, because I claim to be a Christian. I claim to be a follower of Christ. And yet there are times when I refuse to live as if I am, because of the pressures being applied to my life. Like I said before, the slights, the insults, the ignoring, what this person said, what this person did, what money problems, all of it just presses and presses and presses and makes me forget. And I will claim that I'm a Christian, yet sometimes I refuse to live as if I am. And that's what Nehemiah is saying to the elders. Listen, the city is in great trouble because we're disobeying the Lord and we're leaving the cities in ruins when we knew when Cyrus sent us back what God wanted us to do. We need to work together and finish the work. And when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem realized that the elders or the nobles weren't applying enough pressure to stop Nehemiah, they amped up their pressure against the nobles so that the elders would go out and discourage the people and say, listen, we don't want to do this. We're just going to anger the nations. And Nehemiah is going to go back to Susa, assume his position back in the courts, and we are going to have to live at the mercy of the nations. Don't do it. Don't do it. Nehemiah, so much wisdom, so much discernment. Oh, why discernment is so important. Why wisdom in the Lord's way is so important. It's right here. He recognizes their taunts as spiritual warfare. Oh, I wish sometimes I had more discernment than, no, I said sometimes, that's a lie. I wish all the time I had more discernment in my life than I have so that I could recognize the taunts as spiritual warfare and not something directed at me personally. Oh, I wish I had that wisdom and discernment. Nehemiah had it, and you know what he did? He didn't get in an argument or a debate. Now, I might not get in an argument or a debate with what someone said to me externally so that that person can hear me, but inside of me, there's debates and arguments going on all day long. I should have said this. I should have done that. Why didn't I respond this one? How dare they? How dare they? How dare they speak to me that way? Don't they? Oh, there might not be an external that people can hear, but my word, it's going on the inside. Their taunts, Sanballat's, Tobiah, and Geshem's taunts, the elders' taunts, he recognized it for what it was, spiritual warfare to get him to stop. And you know what? He didn't enter into an argument or a debate. That means on the inside too. He just stated the truth. We are God's servants, not you, regardless of what you think. You have no portion in Jerusalem. We will take what belongs to us. We will take what belongs to us. It doesn't belong to us because you say it does. It belongs to us because God says it does. That's what we'll do. So when he decided to build the wall, he put whole families all around the wall. What he didn't do is he didn't build it by sections. He built the whole wall at one time. So the wall rose as a whole. So what does Sanballat do as the wall began to rise? He mustered his army. Now this is all for show. He isn't going to send his armies into Judah because he'd have to deal with Artaxerxes. He isn't going to do that. But the remnant doesn't know that. And they begin to be afraid. Tobiah is there with Sanballat as he musters his army. And they begin to laugh and jeer and make fun of the Jews. And he says, this wall provides no protection. And Tobiah chimes in, if a fox jumped on it, it would fall down. It's so fragile. But their jeers hid their fears. What would this new Jerusalem become under the leadership of Nehemiah? It would become a force that the Samaritans and the Ammonites and the Moabites and all the other surrounding nations would not be able to deal with. So Sanballat again uses connections to convince the people that they are about to be attacked. Now fear floods the families building the walls. And this is what they say. There is too much rubble. There's too much left over from Nebuchadnezzar's destruction. We can't build it fast enough. The rubble is in the way. Men from the surrounding territory who do not have half-built walls to protect them come in and they implore the people, please stop building before Sanballat attacks. Please stop building. Just stop. Just don't anger the nations anymore. Just go back to the way life was. At least we can survive and navigate that world. Jerusalem's resolve is being tested. We're going to Nehemiah 4:15. This is what he tells the people. Nehemiah 4:15. And when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leader stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. And the man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers nor my servants nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. It's at this time that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem realized that they had totally underestimated Nehemiah. They couldn't intimidate him, nor could they make him afraid. So now what they do is they send messengers. They send the same messengers with the same message 4 times. And what they want Nehemiah to do is to come down to them to, I'm about to butcher this name, Hakapharim, in the plain of Ono, so they could talk about what's going on. Here is Nehemiah's response. Now, it's a very famous response. It's in Nehemiah 6, verse 3. And I sent messengers to them, and saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? Nehemiah recognized, he discerned the whole scheme of the enemy. He knew Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem couldn't come up to him. Artaxerxes was protecting him, and those 3 men knew it. The only way they could get the work to stop is if they convinced Nehemiah to stop it. The plain of Ono was a trap. It was a trap. Once there, they would kill Nehemiah, send word back to Artaxerxes that his cupbearer had met a tragic accident. It's so important that you understand that the devil to make you come down to him, because he can't go up to you, because this isn't Artaxerxes protecting you. This is the very risen, reigning King of heaven protecting you. Christ is in you. The devil doesn't want anything more to do with Christ. But if he can get you to come down to him on his battlefield, he will absolutely crush you, because you have chosen to fight on the ground God did not give you. That's why you have to realize that slights, offenses, pressures, being ignored, being passed over, being accused falsely, all of those are the same as Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem sending word to Nehemiah, come down to us. Don't go down. Don't go down. Don't let the work of the Lord stop. Again, valuable lesson, and I need to learn it even more than I have. Now, the 5th time, Sanballat sends a handwritten letter, and he says, there are rumors. We've heard rumors. Geshem's heard them. And they're saying the only reason you're building this wall is because once it's done, you're going to sit on Jerusalem's throne and declare yourself king. Now, listen. We don't believe that, but what's going to happen if Artaxerxes believes it? You're going to need someone to defend yourself from Artaxerxes, and we'll be able to tell him, no, that's not what he intends to do. So why don't you come down so that we can discuss our strategy in sending Artaxerxes word that you don't have any intention of proclaiming yourself king. Again, never ever accept the premise of the enemy's argument. Too many times we accept the premise of the enemy's argument. Someone slights us. I'm just using this as an example. Someone slights us. Someone accuses us of something we didn't do. And the devil will say, you know what? We better get together and discuss how you're going to defend yourself. Because, you didn't really do that. And if this thing gets any further and it goes, let's say, to the boss or to a spouse or to someone else, it's going to make you look bad and you're going to need a defense. So now what happens inside? You've accepted the premise of the argument. And now you're beginning to formulate on the inside of you, I'm sure I am not the only one who has ever done this, an argument, so that when that happens, when the person in charge, whether it be, I don't care, a spouse, a boss, anybody, comes and says, well, you didn't do that, your argument is ready and you're off to the races. No. Let the Lord defend you. That's what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah said, you know what? You're just making stuff up out of whole cloth. First of all, Artaxerxes is never going to believe that. He knows who I am. And second, you're a liar, and I don't listen to liars. The devil is a liar. Let's stop listening to lies, even if they're coming out of other people's mouths. Let's just stop. Never, ever, ever, one more ever, because I feel strongly about this, ever accept the premise of the enemy's argument. Because you're going to have to spend the rest of your life defending yourself against lies and baseless accusations, because you have just shown the enemy that if you are falsely accused, you will come down to him. Sanballat and Tobiah had one more card to play. They hired a prophet to tell Nehemiah that his life was in danger and the Lord has instructed him to hide in the temple. What were Sanballat and Tobiah trying to get Nehemiah to do? To show himself a hypocrite. The remnant were building the wall. They were armed for war while their governor is hiding in the temple like a little girl. He was asking them to risk their lives, but he was unwilling to risk theirs. And if Nehemiah could be displayed as a hypocrite, could be displayed as a coward, then they could get the people to stop building the wall. Nehemiah refused to listen. I love the reason why he refused. The Lord sent him here to build a wall. Why would the Lord suddenly change his mind? That again has spiritual applications. You may have a calling on your life. You may have a territory the Lord wants you to occupy. He may have given you a voice. The Lord isn't going to change his mind on that. It doesn't matter where the influence to stop comes from. The Lord has not changed his mind. The work was completed in 52 days. All the enemy's threats came to nothing. Every time the people tried to break free from the fear, the enemy would begin to apply pressure. And every time the remnant would feel that pressure, and I'm not saying that pressure isn't real. I know it's very real. And at times it can feel like a very heavy, heavy weight upon your chest, upon your heart, and upon your life. What the remnant did when they felt like that, they submitted to their worldview's counsel that they were too weak to resist the enemy. And what did that mean? They became passive to what was happening to them and small in their own eyes. And their enemies exploited their worldview time and time again until the remnant became impoverished and powerless. That statement right there, that the enemy exploited the worldview time and time again until the remnant became impoverished and powerless, could sum up the first 35 years of my Christian life. The enemy exploited my insecure, fearful, self-loathing worldview time and time again until I became, as a Christian, impoverished and powerless. I'm going to tell you right now, this is a terrible way to live. You have this word, and this word is saying the exact opposite. But every time you try to step out, the enemy, knowing you because you have revealed yourself to him, applies the pressure, and you step back and become passive and strong. It's not the Lord's will for you. It's not the Lord's way for you. The Lord's will and way for you is to rise up and be a mighty warrior. Whether you're a worship leader, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a mother, whether you're a teacher, whether you have a business, he wants you to step up and begin to rebuild walls and set gates and reestablish his great name in the sphere of influence he has given to you. This is his will for you, and don't let any enemy tell you differently through all the tricks of pressures that he can apply to get you to stop building and come down to him. Whew. So if you like what you heard and would like to hear more, please hit the like and subscribe button. I appreciate every subscriber I have. I really do appreciate that you took the time to listen and also the time to subscribe. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the most dangerous and frequent question your worldview asks while it navigates through life. And the reason we need to recognize this question and to expose it is because it is a question that keeps you entrapped in false teaching and imprisoned in wrong thoughts. It doesn't allow you to step forward into everything that God has for you. This question is dangerous and it's deadly. And if you ask this question time and time and time again, you will find that it is killing you. So, that's really a sad note to end on, isn't it? So hopefully I will see you next week. Until then, bye.